I withdrew $15 million in untraceable cryptocurrency, packed it tightly into a sleek leather suitcase, and deliberately left it sitting wide open on the floor of our master bedroom. The next morning, my husband vanished along with the money and a hastily scribbled note left on my vanity mirror. The note said he and his mistress were going to live happily ever after without me, and ended by calling me a pathetic failure. I stood there holding that piece of paper in my hand, and I just laughed. I laughed until my ribs ached and tears streamed down my face. Because before he ever laid his greedy hands on that suitcase, I had already switched every single thing inside it. He truly thought he had just stolen a one-way ticket to a tropical paradise, but in reality, he had just hand-delivered his own federal indictment along with one for his little mistress, who just so happened to be my own flesh and blood sister. Before I tell you exactly what was waiting for them inside that bag, let me know where you are listening from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to teach your toxic family a lesson they will never, ever forget. I had spent the last decade building a venture capital firm from the ground up, completely in the shadows. While my family mocked me for dropping out of college to play with code, I was quietly amassing a fortune that dwarfed anything they could ever comprehend. My husband Marcus thought I was just a mid-level data analyst, making a modest salary. He thought he was the undisputed mastermind of our household, parading around in tailored suits that were secretly funded by my quiet investments. He thought he had completely outsmarted his quiet, unassuming wife. He was so very wrong. I barely had time to take another sip of my bourbon when my phone shattered the quiet elegance of my living room. I smoothed down the fabric of my emerald silk dress, relishing the cool material against my skin, and glanced at the caller ID flashing on the screen. It was a group video call from my mother, Patricia, and my father, Harold. I tapped the screen to answer and propped the phone against my crystal decanter. Before the image even fully loaded, my mother was already screaming so loudly the audio on my phone distorted. "Maya, where is your husband?" My mother demanded, her face red and contorted with an ugly rage. "You better tell me right now, because Bradley is having a full-blown panic attack in my kitchen, and you need to fix this." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my drink, letting the aged whiskey burn the back of my throat. Bradley is my brother-in-law, a white man who married my sister Chloe and constantly paraded around our family gatherings in poorly tailored suits, acting like he was the next big investment guru. He ran what he called an exclusive crypto investment fund, but anyone with half a brain and access to basic public records could see the glaring cracks in his cheap veneer. "I do not keep my husband on a leash, Mom," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. "He packed a bag and left early this morning. I assumed he had another one of his sudden, very important business trips." My father Harold shoved his face into the camera frame, practically knocking my mother out of the way. "Do not play your arrogant games with us, Maya. Your husband was supposed to transfer $5 million into Bradley's investment fund yesterday afternoon to cover a massive margin call. Bradley's entire portfolio just collapsed because Marcus vanished with the capital. What did you do to drive him away this time?" There it was, the inevitable pivot to blame me. It did not matter that Marcus was a grown man making his own decisions, or that Bradley was a reckless fraud playing with other people's life savings. In the Jenkins household, if something went wrong, it was always somehow my fault. I was the eldest daughter, the one who supposedly lacked the natural charm and effortless grace of my younger sister, Chloe. They viewed me as a stubborn, difficult disappointment who dropped out of a prestigious college to hide behind computer screens, choosing a boring tech career over proper high society networking. My mother adjusted her perfectly styled hair, still trying to maintain her country club composure while her world burned. "You always do this, Maya. You always try to make yourself sound smarter than the men in this family. Marcus is a financial genius. Bradley is a visionary. You are just a bitter woman who could not keep her husband happy. If you had just paid more attention to him instead of your computer screens, he would not have felt the need to run away." I set my glass down the crystal, making a sharp clinking sound against the marble countertop. It is fascinating how quickly you blame me, Dad. I leaned closer to the camera, making sure they could see the absolute calm in my eyes. Just like 10 years ago when you both forced me to pawn my only car to pay off Chloe's massive credit card debt. You remember that, right? She just had to have those designer bags to impress her sorority sisters, and you told me it was my duty as the older sister to sacrifice for the face of the family. You said she was the golden child who needed to maintain our reputation. Well, the golden face of the family seems to attract a lot of severe financial emergencies. And Chloe, my sweet, innocent sister, who could do no wrong. She had been sleeping with my husband for over a year. I had known about it for exactly 11 months. I watched them exchange secret glances at Sunday dinners. I saw the way her foot would brush against his leg under the table, while she smiled sweetly at me and complained about how stressful it was being married to a genius like Bradley. I let them think they were the smartest people in the room. I played the oblivious wife perfectly because I knew that revenge served cold was not just a saying, it was a requirement for absolute destruction. "Do not you dare bring up the past, Maya," my mother shrieked, completely ignoring my point. "Bradley is losing everything. He needed that $5 million to save his business, and your husband just abandoned him in his hour of need. You need to sign the deed to your house over to Bradley right now to cover the loss. You owe this family your support. You have always been so selfish, keeping your little tech money to yourself, while your sister struggles to support a hard-working husband." I actually laughed out loud this time, a genuine sound of amusement that seemed to confuse them both. "I owe you a house because your son-in-law made a bad bet." Mother listened to me very carefully. Bradley did not lose that money to a bad investment, and Marcus did not simply forget to make the transfer. Marcus stole it. He took every single dime of that $5 million, cleared out his own hidden offshore accounts, and ran. He is not coming back to save Bradley or anyone else. He has been planning this for months. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. I could see the color completely drain from my father's face as the reality of my words began to sink in. But my mother, being the absolute master of denial, immediately shook her head side to side. "You are lying." She spat, her voice trembling with a mixture of rising fear and deep stubbornness. "Marcus is a good man from a good family. He would never do something like that to us. In fact, he just texted me an hour ago. He said he was taking Chloe on a surprise trip to Paris to help her take her mind off Bradley's business troubles. He is taking care of your sister, while you sit there in your empty house spreading vicious lies because you are jealous. You have always been jealous of how much Marcus adores her." I picked up my bourbon and offered a mock toast to the camera lens. "Paris." I smiled, letting the sharp edge of my amusement slice right through the thick tension radiating from the screen. "That is truly unfortunate for them, Mom, because the flight they boarded is not going to Paris. It is going straight into the hands of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The echo of my mother screaming over the phone had barely faded from the high ceilings of my living room when the heavy mahogany front door was violently shoved open. I did not even flinch. I simply took another sip of my bourbon and watched the invasion unfold. Less than 10 minutes had passed since I ended that call, and here they were. My father Harold stormed in first, his jaw tight and his eyes scanning the room as if he owned the place. Right on his heels was my mother Patricia, still clutching her phone like a weapon. But it was the man who pushed past both of them that brought a genuine smile to my face. Bradley Smith, my brother-in-law. He stomped into my home wearing one of his poorly fitted pastel suits, looking every bit the arrogant tech bro he pretended to be. Bradley had always possessed a profound sense of unearned superiority. Marrying my sister Chloe had given him a VIP pass into a wealthy black family, and he wore his white privilege like a badge of honor, constantly talking down to me about investments and market trends. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face as he marched across my Persian rug. "You are going to fix this right now, Maya," Bradley barked, his face flushed an ugly shade of crimson. "Your husband just tanked my entire fund. $5 million wiped out because Marcus decided to play games with my investors' money. You are going to list this house today. I already called my real estate broker. We are putting this property on the market, and the proceeds are going directly into my holding account to cover the deficit your husband created." My father stepped forward, pulling a thick stack of legal documents from his leather briefcase and slamming them onto my glass coffee table. He did not even bother to ask how I was holding up after my husband supposedly abandoned me. He just tapped the top of the paper with his expensive gold pen. "Sign the power of attorney, Maya." My father commanded, his voice carrying that same authoritative tone he used when he forced me to empty my college savings account a decade ago. "Do not make this harder than it has to be. Bradley is facing serious legal trouble if he cannot replace those funds by Monday morning. Marcus is your responsibility. As his wife, you absorb his debts. You are going to sign this house over to Bradley, and then you are going to call your little tech company and liquidate whatever stock options you have. We are not letting this family face a public scandal because you could not keep your husband in line." I looked at the documents, then at my father. It was breathtaking, really. The sheer audacity of their entitlement. They had burst into my home demanding I strip myself of everything I owned to save a man who actively mocked my career at every Thanksgiving dinner. My mother crossed her arms, glaring at me with absolute disgust. "Stop looking at us like that and pick up the pen, Maya. Bradley is a visionary. His fund is the future of this family. Chloe is devastated right now. She had to fly to Paris alone just to escape the stress of this financial disaster. The least you can do is secure her husband's business while she tries to heal from the trauma your husband caused." I stood up slowly, letting the silence stretch out and wrap around the room. I walked past the papers on the coffee table, completely ignoring my father's outstretched hand offering the pen. I glided over to the media console, running my fingers lightly across the smooth surface. Bradley let out a loud, exasperated sigh, tossing his hands in the air. "Are you deaf, Maya?" Bradley shouted, stepping closer to me, trying to use his height for intimidation. "I do not have time for your typical silent treatment. My investors are breathing down my neck. You are going to pay for what Marcus did, or I swear to God I will drag your name into the lawsuit as a co-conspirator. I will tell the feds you helped him hide the money." "You are going to tell the feds?" I asked softly, picking up the sleek remote control. "That is a brilliant idea, Bradley. But before you call them, I think you should see exactly where your money went." I pressed the power button. The massive 85-inch screen on the wall flickered to life. I pressed another button, and the screen split perfectly down the middle. On the right side, a digital map appeared showing a glowing red dot blinking steadily over the coordinates of a private airfield just outside the city limits. It was the GPS tracking signal from Marcus's phone. I had installed a phantom mirroring app on his device months ago. On the left side of the screen, a crystal-clear high-definition video feed began to stream. It was a live security camera feed from the VIP lounge of that exact private airport. The lounge was dripping in luxury with plush velvet chairs and complimentary champagne bars. I had paid a very hefty sum to a private security contractor to grant me backdoor access to this specific camera. My father scoffed, waving his hand at the screen. "What is this nonsense, Maya? We do not have time for your computer tricks. We need you to sign these papers right now." "Look closer, Dad," I said, pointing the remote at the television. "I think Bradley might recognize someone." The three of them turned their heads toward the screen. The high-definition camera zoomed in slightly on a couple standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows of the VIP lounge. The man was wearing a custom-tailored charcoal suit, holding a sleek leather suitcase tightly in his right hand. It was the exact suitcase I had left in my bedroom the night before. It was Marcus. But it was the woman standing next to him that made the air in my living room completely vanish. She was wearing a stunning red trench coat, her designer sunglasses pushed up into her perfectly styled hair. She reached out, grabbing Marcus by the lapels of his suit, and pulled him in. Right there on the live feed in crisp, undeniable color, my husband wrapped his free arm around her waist and kissed her with a desperate, hungry passion. The woman kissing my husband was not just some random mistress. It was my younger sister. It was Chloe. A sharp, sickening gasp echoed through my living room. I turned my head just in time to see my mother's mouth fall open. The color drained entirely from her face, leaving her looking pale and hollow. Her fingers went slack, and her prized Hermes Birkin bag slipped from her grasp, hitting the hardwood floor with a heavy, dull thud. My father stumbled backward, bumping into the edge of the sofa, his eyes wide and unblinking as he stared at the television screen. But Bradley's reaction was the true masterpiece. The arrogant, entitled tech bro who had just threatened to throw me in prison was standing completely paralyzed. His chest heaved as he watched his beautiful, perfect wife, the woman he thought was crying on a flight to Paris, currently running her hands through his brother-in-law's hair. His mouth opened to speak, but no sound came out. He just stared at the screen as Marcus and Chloe finally pulled apart, laughing together like two teenagers who had just pulled off the heist of the century. I took a step toward Bradley, closing the distance between us. I let a slow, satisfied smile spread across my face as I looked up into his horrified eyes. "You thought your wife went to Paris to decompress?" I asked, my voice smooth and conversational, masking the venom underneath. "You thought she was flying commercial to heal from the trauma. No, Bradley. She is standing in a private terminal right now. She is going on a permanent honeymoon with my $15 million and your $5 million. And you are standing in my living room demanding that I sell my house to cover the bill for her getaway." Bradley's hands began to shake. He looked from the screen to me, and then back to the screen. His mind was struggling to process the monumental betrayal unfolding right in front of him. But my mother could not accept it. Even with the undeniable truth broadcasting directly into her eyes, she still tried to protect her golden child. "This is a trick," my mother stammered, her voice trembling as she pointed a shaking finger at the television. "You fabricated this, Maya. You altered the video to make your sister look bad. Chloe would never do this. She loves Bradley. She told me she was going to Paris." I turned to face my mother, the smile dropping from my face instantly. "Wake up, Mom," I said, my tone dropping to a dead serious chill. "I did not fabricate anything. You are watching a live feed. Your perfect daughter has been sleeping in my bed with my husband for over a year. They have been planning to steal my wealth and leave this country to live like royalty. They used Bradley's fraudulent fund to launder the cash they needed for the getaway." Bradley snapped his head toward me, his eyes bloodshot and wide with panic. "What do you mean, fraudulent fund?" he demanded, his voice finally breaking through his paralysis. I tilted my head, looking at him with absolute pity. "I mean that your $5 million loss is not an accounting error, Bradley. Marcus transferred that money into an offshore account that Chloe controls. They drained your entire operation, but do not worry about the money. You have much bigger problems to face today." I turned back to the television screen, watching Marcus casually set the leather suitcase down on a glass table in the lounge. He unlatched the locks and opened it, reaching inside to pull out his laptop. He was getting ready to check his balances. He was getting ready to bask in his stolen glory. I raised my bourbon glass toward the screen. "Right on schedule," I murmured. "Watch closely, everyone. You are about to see what happens when a rat finally takes the cheese." Bradley stood there with his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled fresh from the water. The reality of his beautiful, status-obsessed wife wrapping her arms around my husband was completely breaking his brain. He jammed his hand into his pastel suit pocket and pulled out his phone. His fingers were trembling so violently, he dropped the device twice before finally dialing her number. He put it on speakerphone so we could all hear the automated voice telling him the number he was trying to reach had blocked incoming calls. She had completely shut him out. The realization hit him hard, but instead of sadness, it turned into a blind, frantic rage. He threw his phone against the wall, watching it shatter into pieces across my hardwood floor. He turned his bloodshot eyes on me. In his mind, I had to be the one pulling the strings. Because I worked in tech, he assumed I possessed some master password or some backdoor access to the accounts Marcus had drained. He lunged across the room, his hands reaching out to grab my throat, screaming that I needed to log in and freeze the blockchain transfers right this second. I did not even blink. I did not take a single step back. Before his manicured hands could get anywhere near my silk dress, two massive figures stepped out from the shadows of the adjacent dining room. I had hired elite private security weeks ago, anticipating exactly this kind of unhinged physical reaction from desperate men. They moved with terrifying efficiency. One bodyguard grabbed Bradley by the collar of his expensive suit, while the other seized his outstretched arm, twisting it sharply behind his back. Bradley let out a high-pitched yelp of pain as they drove him downward, pinning him face first against the cold marble of my coffee table. His cheeks squished right against the ridiculous power of attorney documents my father had demanded I sign moments earlier. My father, Harold, completely lost what little composure he had left. His face turned a dangerous shade of purple as he stepped forward, pointing a shaking finger at me. He ordered me to call off my thugs. He actually demanded that I show respect to my brother-in-law. My father looked at the man pinned to the table, a man whose wife had just publicly humiliated him on a live television feed, and still chose to defend him over his own daughter. He screamed that I was a cold-blooded monster. He said I was exactly like my grandmother, heartless, calculating, and completely devoid of human decency. The mention of my grandmother was supposed to be a devastating insult, but to me it was the highest compliment anyone could possibly give. My grandmother was the only person in this family who actually worked for what she had. She built a massive real estate portfolio from absolutely nothing, while my father squandered her legacy on country club memberships and terrible investments. She taught me how to read a balance sheet before I was 10 years old. I smiled at him, a slow, freezing smile that made him stop shouting instantly. I walked over to the side table, picked up a thick, heavy manila folder, and dropped it onto the glass coffee table right in front of Bradley's sweating face. The loud smack of the paper hitting the glass echoed in the silent room. I told my father to take a very good look at the man he was so desperately defending. I told him to open the folder. Inside were months of meticulous financial forensics that I had quietly compiled using my firm's advanced data analytics. I explained that Bradley was not a financial genius. He was not a visionary entrepreneur. His entire cryptocurrency investment fund was nothing but a cheap, glorified Ponzi scheme. He was using new investor money to pay off the old investors, skimming millions off the top to fund Chloe's lavish lifestyle and his own expensive habits. There was no proprietary trading algorithm. There was no genius market strategy. It was a house of cards waiting for a strong breeze. Bradley tried to squirm under the weight of the security guard, but the man simply pressed harder, pushing Bradley's face further into the table. My mother, Patricia, began to sob quietly, covering her mouth with her hands as the illusion of her perfect family crumbled into dust. But that was not even the worst part. I looked my father dead in the eye and delivered the final, absolute blow. I explained that the $5 million Marcus had just stolen, the money Bradley was begging me to replace, did not belong to regular retail investors. It belonged to a highly organized money laundering cartel operating out of Miami. Bradley had gotten completely desperate when his funds started bleeding cash, and he took their dirty money to keep his sinking ship afloat. And now that the money was gone, those extremely dangerous people were not going to call the local police or file a civil lawsuit. They were going to collect their debt in blood. I leaned down, bringing my face close to Bradley's trembling head, and then looked back up at my father. I told him that since he had personally co-signed the original bank loan to help Bradley start his shiny new business, his name was right there on the cartel's ledger too. I smiled brightly at my parents and informed them that the violent people Bradley owed would be knocking on their front door in exactly 24 hours. The shiny skin of a sliced plum on my glass coffee table blurred in my vision, melting seamlessly into the glossy golden skin of the massive roasted turkey sitting in the center of my dining room table 48 hours earlier. The air in the room back then was thick and suffocating, bathed in a warm yellow glow from the crystal chandelier overhead that made the entire holiday scene look like a grotesque painting of gluttony and deceit. The smell of sage butter and heavy, expensive perfume lingered in the tight space pressing down on my chest as I sat silently at the foot of the table. Bradley was holding court at the opposite end, a position he had presumptuously claimed the moment he walked into my house for the Thanksgiving holiday. He swirled a heavy pour of my most expensive vintage Cabernet, projecting the aura of a Wall Street titan while enthusiastically pitching his cryptocurrency investment fund. He threw around meaningless buzzwords like decentralized ledgers, algorithmic yield farming, and guaranteed quarterly returns with the slick, practiced cadence of a seasoned con artist. My father Harold leaned forward, resting his elbows on the imported linen tablecloth hanging onto Bradley's every word, as if the man were dispensing sacred financial wisdom. My mother Patricia nodded along, taking delicate bites of her cranberry stuffing. She looked across the table at me, offering one of her signature tight-lipped smiles that always preceded an insult. She announced to the table that it was truly a blessing that Bradley was willing to let family in on the ground floor of his exclusive fund. She then pointedly added that it was incredibly fortunate Marcus had the financial foresight to manage my recent little windfall. In her mind, the $15 million I had earned from selling the data analytics firm I built from absolute scratch was merely a stroke of dumb luck. To my parents, my decade of missed holidays, sleepless nights, and relentless ambition was a fluke. They firmly believed my husband was the necessary adult required to handle the actual business of managing that kind of capital. I sat quietly, cutting my turkey with surgical precision. I let them talk. I let them weave their web of self-importance. Marcus sat to my right, adjusting the cuffs of his custom Italian suit. He leaned back in his dining chair, adopting the posture of a benevolent king, ready to bestow gifts upon his loyal subjects. He casually announced to the breathless room that after reviewing Bradley's prospectus, he was fully committed to backing the fund. He promised to inject the entire $15 million of my company's sale money into Bradley's operation. He spoke about the money as if he had earned it himself, framing the decision as his brilliant strategic masterstroke to secure our family's generational wealth. Bradley practically vibrated with excitement, raising his wineglass in a toast to Marcus, calling him a true visionary. My parents beamed with pride, completely ignoring the absurd fact that their son-in-law was casually promising away my entire life's work without so much as glancing in my direction for approval. Sitting directly across from Marcus was my younger sister Chloe. She wore a pristine white cashmere sweater, looking every bit the innocent golden child my parents had raised her to be. She offered Marcus a sweet, admiring smile, telling him how incredibly generous and brilliant he was. She said Bradley was so lucky to have a mentor like him to guide his business. As she spoke, I reached across the table to pick up a large silver serving spoon resting near the mashed potatoes. The polished antique silver was curved perfectly, acting like a highly reflective convex mirror. As I lifted the spoon, the reflection caught the shadowed space beneath the heavy linen tablecloth. I froze my grip, tightening on the cool metal handle. There, reflected clearly in the silver spoon, was Chloe's bare foot, slipped entirely out of her designer heel deliberately and slowly sliding up the inside of Marcus's calf. I watched his leg shift slightly, leaning into her illicit touch under my own dining table. A microscopic smirk played at the corner of his mouth as he took a sip of his wine, maintaining perfect eye contact with my father, while my sister caressed him in plain sight. A cold, absolute clarity washed over me. I did not drop the spoon. I did not scream. I did not throw my wine in his face and demand they leave my house. Instead, I served myself a modest portion of potatoes and set the spoon down gently. They thought I was blind. They thought I was a pathetic workaholic who was so disconnected from reality that I would just sit there and blindly fund their twisted fantasy life. Marcus, feeling the massive rush of adrenaline from the secret physical contact and the family's relentless adulation, decided he needed to prove his absolute dominance right then and there. He snapped his fingers, declaring that talk was cheap and he was a man of action. He stood up from the table and retrieved his sleek silver laptop from his leather briefcase in the hallway. He brought the laptop right to the dining table, pushing aside the crystal gravy boat and the breadbasket to make room. He opened the screen, typing in his password with aggressive theatrical keystrokes. He announced to the captive audience that he was going to initiate a $5 million good faith deposit into Bradley's holding account immediately just to show the family how serious he was about their shared financial future. Bradley let out a triumphant bark of laughter, clapping his hands together while my parents watched Marcus with pure, unadulterated awe. Marcus navigated to the online portal for our joint offshore holding account, where the $15 million was parked temporarily before I was supposed to move it into my secure corporate trusts. He typed in the lengthy routing numbers that Bradley eagerly read off from his own phone screen. While all eyes were glued to the glowing screen of Marcus's laptop, I quietly reached into the pocket of my slacks and pulled out my smartphone. I kept the device completely concealed beneath the edge of the table, resting it flat on my lap. I used my thumb to unlock the screen and bypass the standard applications, opening a hidden encrypted security program I had personally coded months ago when I first suspected Marcus was trying to move my assets. Marcus hovered his finger over the enter key, boasting about the massive exponential returns they were going to see by the end of the fiscal quarter. He looked directly at Chloe, giving her a subtle, knowing wink that made my stomach turn with disgust. He told Bradley to refresh his banking app in exactly 30 seconds because his life was about to change forever. I watched Marcus's finger descend toward the keyboard. At that exact split second, my thumb pressed the heavy red activation icon on my phone screen. The command bypassed the bank's standard servers, communicating directly with the primary security node of our joint offshore account. Marcus hit the enter key with a loud, decisive clack. He leaned back, crossing his arms behind his head and waiting for the standard green confirmation screen to appear. But the screen did not turn green. Instead, a glaring bright red banner slashed across the entire width of his laptop monitor. A harsh digital error chime echoed through the quiet dining room, cutting through the festive holiday atmosphere like a siren. Marcus frowned, leaning forward and squinting at the screen. He aggressively hit the refresh button. The red banner remained completely unchanged. He muttered a curse under his breath, pulling out his own phone and frantically opening his mobile banking application. He tapped the screen repeatedly, his face growing redder by the second as the network struggled to load. The app finally opened, displaying a giant warning icon right over the primary balance. The dining room went completely dead silent. The joyous celebratory energy evaporated instantly, replaced by a thick, suffocating tension that seemed to suck the oxygen from the air. My mother lowered her wine glass, asking tentatively if everything was all right with the transfer. Bradley leaned over the table, staring at the laptop screen with wide, panicked eyes, his hands gripping the edge of the mahogany wood. Marcus slowly lowered his phone. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and suddenly very small. The error message on his screen was unmistakable. Account frozen. Security protocol initiated. Contact primary administrator. His head snapped up. His eyes bypassed Bradley, bypassed my parents, and locked directly onto me, sitting quietly at the end of the table with my hands neatly folded in my lap. The fake, benevolent smile melted off his face, replaced by a mask of pure, unhinged rage. His chest heaved as he slammed his hands flat against the mahogany table, causing the fine china and crystal glasses to rattle violently. "What the hell did you just do to our joint account?" I stared back at him, letting my eyes widen into a perfect mask of bewildered innocence. The silence in the dining room was absolute, broken only by the sound of Bradley's heavy, panicked breathing and the faint hum of the crystal chandelier above us. Marcus was practically vibrating with rage. The vein in his forehead throbbed rhythmically as he gripped the edge of the mahogany table, leaning his entire body weight toward me. He demanded to know why the bank had suddenly locked him out of the $15 million he was seconds away from handing over to my scammer brother-in-law. Before I could even formulate my carefully prepared excuse, my father slammed his open palm down on the table. The silverware clattered violently against the fine china. He pointed a thick, calloused finger directly at my face. His features twisted in the same familiar expression of deep disappointment I had endured my entire life. He told me I was completely out of my mind. He yelled that this was exactly why he never trusted me with real family responsibilities. According to Harold, my success in the tech world was nothing more than a lucky break, a fluke, that I was now aggressively squandering because I lacked the basic fundamental understanding of how true wealth operated. He looked at Marcus with profound apology, acting as if my husband was the true victim of my incompetence. He told Marcus he was deeply sorry that I was acting like a hysterical, controlling woman who could not recognize a golden investment opportunity when it was handed to her on a silver platter. My mother did not miss a single beat. Patricia set her wine glass down with a sharp, distinct clink and immediately joined the firing squad. She leaned across the table, her heavy, expensive perfume wafting toward me, masking the scent of the roasted turkey. She shook her head dramatically, declaring that I was suffocating my husband. She told the entire table that she had warned Marcus before our wedding that I possessed a deeply stubborn and uncooperative nature. In her twisted narrative, I was the broken, defective daughter who refused to be a supportive wife. She lamented loudly that a man of Marcus's brilliant financial caliber was being held back by a woman who insisted on hoarding her money like a paranoid miser instead of trusting the man who had supposedly sworn to protect her. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap, pressing my fingernails into my palms to keep from smiling. They were performing exactly as I knew they would. The golden rule of my family was simple. Whenever there was a conflict, default to destroying Maya. Then came the performance I was truly waiting for. Chloe shifted in her chair, her pristine white cashmere sweater catching the warm light of the chandelier. She looked at Marcus with wide doe eyes swimming with manufactured sympathy. She reached across the table and placed her hand gently over his knuckles, the same knuckles that had just violently struck the dining table. She let her fingers linger there for just a second too long, a brazen display of affection disguised as sisterly comfort. Chloe sighed softly, letting her gaze drift over to me with an expression of profound pity. She said she simply did not understand why I had to make everything so difficult. She told me that if Bradley ever needed her support for his business, she would give him everything without a single question. She tilted her head, her voice dropping an octave as she took her final, calculated dig. She said Marcus worked so incredibly hard for our family, and it was truly tragic that he had to fight his own wife just to secure our financial future. The implication hung heavy and toxic in the air. I did not deserve him. I was a failure of a wife, and Chloe, with her boundless empathy and understanding, was the woman he truly deserved. The urge to reach across the table, grab her by her perfectly styled hair, and drag her face first into the cranberry sauce was incredibly strong. But I am not a creature of impulse. I am a creature of strategy. I knew that if I exploded right then and there, I would become the hysterical woman they were already accusing me of being. I would give them exactly what they wanted, so I did what I do best. I adapted, and I gave them a completely different show. I forced my breathing to hitch. I dropped my gaze to my lap, letting my shoulders slump forward in a posture of absolute defeat. I bit the inside of my cheek hard enough to draw blood, letting the sharp physical pain push hot, genuine tears into my eyes. When I finally looked back up at Marcus, my eyes were brimming with moisture and my voice trembled perfectly. I told him I was so sorry. I let a single tear spill over my lashes and roll down my cheek. I explained in a fragile, stammering voice that I had not done anything malicious to the account. I spun a masterful lie detailing how the sudden aggregation of $15 million from the sale of my company had triggered an automatic federal anti-money laundering audit. I told him the banking algorithms had automatically frozen the routing numbers because we had never attempted to transfer that kind of capital in a single transaction before. I made myself look terrified, overwhelmed, and completely out of my depth. I looked at my father, apologizing profusely for embarrassing the family. I looked at Bradley, who was still sweating profusely, and swore to him that I fully intended to fund his venture. I played the role of the submissive, panicked wife to absolute perfection. Marcus stared at me, his chest still heaving, but the sheer force of his rage began to shift into greedy calculation. His massive ego simply could not resist the sight of me crumbling before him. He demanded to know how long the audit freeze would last, his tone still dripping with condescension. I wiped my cheek with the back of my hand, sniffing softly. I told him the bank representative had assured me the digital freeze would automatically lift in exactly 24 hours once the compliance review was complete. But I did not stop there. I knew I needed to hand him the ultimate bait to keep him right where I wanted him. I leaned forward, dropping my voice into a conspiratorial whisper, meant only for him, but loud enough for Chloe to hear. I told him we did not even have to wait for the digital accounts to clear. I reminded him about the encrypted cold wallet, the physical hard drive, where I kept my original, uncached crypto assets. I promised him that the physical ledger was sitting safely in my personal wall safe upstairs. I swore to him that tomorrow night, when the biometric security lock on the safe cycled its weekly reset, I would hand him the master passcode. I told him he could take the physical drive and personally execute the transfer to Bradley's fund, ensuring there would be no more digital banking errors. The physical cold wallet. It was the holy grail of untraceable wealth. I watched the profound greed light up Marcus's eyes, completely blinding him to any potential trap. He bought every single word of my tearful performance because it confirmed everything he already believed about me. He believed I was weak. He believed I was stupid. And most importantly, he believed he had finally won. He let out a long, heavy breath, smoothing down the lapels of his suit jacket and forcing a tight, magnanimous smile. He told me that I should have let him handle the bank protocols from the very beginning. He accepted my apology with the grace of a conquering hero, patting my hand dismissively before turning his attention back to Bradley to assure him the funds were secured for tomorrow. My parents immediately relaxed, the tension in their shoulders vanishing as they praised Marcus for his incredible patience and leadership. Chloe smiled brightly, raising her wineglass to take a celebratory sip, her eyes locking with Marcus's over the rim of the crystal. I pushed my chair back from the table, the legs scraping softly against the hardwood. I kept my head lowered, whispering that I felt a terrible migraine coming on and needed to excuse myself to lie down. My mother waved me away without even looking at me, telling me to go rest, so I would not ruin the rest of their evening with my dramatics. I walked slowly out of the dining room, keeping my posture slumped and defeated, until I turned the corner into the main hallway. The moment I was out of their line of sight, the fragile victim persona evaporated instantly. I stood up straight, rolling my shoulders back. I reached up and calmly wiped the remaining moisture from my cheeks. My face turned to absolute stone. The grand hallway was quiet, bathed in the soft glow of the wall sconces. As I walked silently toward the sweeping wooden staircase leading up to my master suite, I noticed Chloe's oversized designer handbag resting on the mahogany console table near the front door. She had dumped it there carelessly when she arrived. It was a disgustingly expensive piece of leather purchased with the credit cards I was once forced to pay off. I stopped. I glanced back toward the dining room. I could hear Marcus loudly debating tax havens with my father, while Bradley laughed obnoxiously in the background. They were completely occupied. I stepped softly over to the console table. My fingers expertly located the heavy gold zipper on Chloe's bag. I pulled it back silently, sliding my hand into the silk-lined interior. My fingers brushed past her expensive cosmetics and a heavy set of keys before brushing against a stiff, crisp paper envelope tucked into the side pocket. I pulled the envelope out just enough to see the embossed logo of an exclusive luxury travel agency. I flipped the flap open. Inside were 2 physical boarding passes printed on heavy premium cardstock. I slid them out, reading the names printed in bold black ink. Marcus Jenkins and Chloe Smith. First-class seats on a private charter. I traced my finger over the destination and the departure time. Geneva, Switzerland, scheduled for takeoff at 7 o'clock Sunday evening. Switzerland. A country notoriously famous for its banking secrecy and its incredibly complicated extradition laws. It was the absolute perfect place to disappear with $15 million of stolen cryptocurrency. The timeline suddenly locked into a perfect, fatal grid in my mind. Tomorrow night, I would hand Marcus the cold wallet. Sunday morning, he would empty the physical drive into his offshore accounts. By Sunday evening, he and my sweet, innocent sister would be thousands of feet in the air, drinking champagne and leaving Bradley to face the very violent men he owed money to. I slid the tickets perfectly back into the envelope, tucked the envelope back into the exact pocket of the designer bag, and silently zipped it closed. I turned and walked up the stairs to my bedroom, my mind already executing the final flawless steps of my plan. They thought they had outsmarted me. They thought Sunday evening was their grand escape to paradise. They had no idea that Sunday evening was the exact moment the steel jaws of my trap were going to snap shut permanently. The silence in my dining room was shattered by my father slamming his fist onto the table. The crystal wine glasses rattled violently against the mahogany. He pointed a trembling finger at me, his face twisted with absolute disgust. He shouted that I was a useless, hysterical woman who was actively sabotaging my husband. He told Marcus he was deeply sorry that I possessed such a paranoid, uncooperative nature. My mother chimed in immediately, her voice dripping with venom. She declared to the entire table that she had always known I would hold Marcus back. She called me a pathetic control freak who lacked the basic intelligence to understand high-level finance. But it was Chloe who delivered the final theatrical touch. She kept her hand resting on Marcus's arm, looking at him with wide, sympathetic eyes. She sighed softly, saying it was truly a tragedy that Marcus worked so incredibly hard for this family, only to be fought at every turn by a wife who never truly deserved him. I did not scream. I did not throw my wine glass. I let my shoulders slump forward, collapsing inward like a fragile, frightened bird. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper, forcing hot, genuine tears to well up in my eyes. I let my breath hitch perfectly, mimicking a panic attack. I looked up at Marcus, my voice trembling and weak. I stammered out a pathetic apology. I told him I did not do anything maliciously. I fed them a desperate lie, explaining that the sudden aggregation of $15 million from my company sale had triggered an automatic federal anti-money laundering audit. I sobbed, saying the bank algorithms had frozen the transfer because of the sheer volume of the transaction. I made myself look terrified and completely out of my depth. Marcus stared at me, his chest heaving. His massive ego simply could not resist the sight of me crumbling before him. The raw anger in his eyes slowly shifted into greedy calculation. He demanded to know how long the audit would take, his tone dripping with absolute contempt. I wiped my face with trembling hands. I told him the bank representative assured me the digital freeze would lift in exactly 24 hours. But I knew I needed to hand him the ultimate bait. I dropped my voice to a frantic whisper, promising him that we did not even have to wait for the digital accounts. I reminded him about the encrypted hardware wallet, the physical cold storage drive sitting in my bedroom wall safe. I swore to him through fake tears that tomorrow night, when the biometric lock cycled its weekly reset, I would hand him the master passcode. I told him he could take the physical drive and execute the transfer to Bradley himself, ensuring there would be no more banking errors. He bought every single word. They all did. They believed my performance because it confirmed exactly what they wanted to believe about me. I was weak. I was stupid. And Marcus had finally won. He let out a heavy breath, smoothing his suit jacket and magnanimously accepting my apology. He told me I should have let him handle the banking protocols from the start. My parents immediately relaxed, praising his patience. Chloe smiled brightly, taking a celebratory sip of her wine. I pushed my chair back, whispering that I had a terrible migraine and needed to lie down. My mother waved me away without looking at me, telling me to go rest, so I would not ruin the rest of their evening. I walked slowly out of the dining room, keeping my posture slumped, until I turned the corner into the main hallway. The moment I was out of their line of sight, the tears stopped instantly. My face turned to absolute stone. As I walked toward the sweeping wooden staircase, I noticed Chloe's oversized designer handbag resting on the console table near the front door. She had dumped it there carelessly when she arrived. I stopped. I could hear Marcus loudly debating tax havens with my father in the dining room. They were completely occupied. I stepped softly to the table and located the heavy gold zipper on Chloe's bag. I pulled it back silently, sliding my hand into the silk interior. My fingers brushed past her cosmetics and a set of keys before touching a stiff paper envelope tucked into the side pocket. I pulled it out just enough to see the embossed logo of a luxury travel agency. I flipped the flap open. Inside were 2 physical boarding passes printed on heavy premium cardstock. I read the names printed in bold black ink. Marcus Jenkins and Chloe Smith. First-class seats on a private charter. The destination was Geneva, Switzerland. The departure time was 7 o'clock Sunday evening. Switzerland, a country notoriously famous for its banking secrecy and complicated extradition laws. The timeline locked perfectly into place. Tomorrow night I would hand Marcus the cold wallet. Sunday morning he would empty the drive into his offshore accounts. By Sunday evening he and my sweet innocent sister would be thousands of feet in the air, leaving Bradley to face his financial ruin alone. I slid the tickets back into the envelope, tucked it into the exact pocket of the designer bag, and silently zipped it closed. I turned and walked up the stairs to my bedroom, my mind cold and perfectly clear. I bypassed my bedroom entirely and walked down the hall to the small utility closet. I moved the cleaning supplies aside and pressed my thumb against a hidden biometric scanner, flush against the baseboard. A section of the wall clicked and slid open, revealing my true sanctuary. My secret home office was bathed in the cool blue light of 3 massive, ultra-high-definition monitors. This was my domain. The place where I had built my tech empire while they thought I was just playing with computers. I sat down in the ergonomic leather chair and woke the system. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard with blistering speed. I initiated the backdoor access protocol I had silently installed on Marcus's silver laptop months ago. Within seconds, I was inside his hard drive, bypassing his pathetic firewall. I did not just want to see the money transfers. I wanted to see his entire digital footprint. I ran a deep forensic sweep targeting hidden folders, encrypted zip files, and deleted document caches. The progress bar hit 100%. A hidden directory materialized on my center screen. I opened it and my blood ran absolutely cold. It was a collection of high-resolution scanned legal documents. I opened the first file. It was a commercial loan guarantee agreement for Bradley's fraudulent cryptocurrency fund. The debt was $5 million. But the lender was not a bank. The lender was a shell corporation tied directly to the Miami money laundering cartel I had been tracking. I zoomed in on the final page of the document. Right there on the signature line was my name. My signature, flawlessly forged. The sheer magnitude of their evil washed over me. Marcus and Chloe were not just planning to steal my $15 million and run away to Switzerland. They were using my name to guarantee the cartel money Bradley had lost. When the cartel came to collect their $5 million debt, Marcus and Chloe would be untouchable in Geneva. I would be the one left holding the bag. I would be the one the cartel targeted. They did not just want to leave me broke. They wanted me dead or rotting in a federal prison. A dark, dangerous calm settled over my mind. The time for tears was over. The time for playing the victim was dead. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a brand new sealed cryptocurrency hardware wallet. It was a sleek, heavy piece of black metal that looked exactly like the one I kept in my wall safe. I plugged it into my secure terminal. I was not going to put $15 million on this drive. I was going to build a weapon. I opened my code editor and began to type. Line after line of complex, aggressive malware flooded my screens. I was not just writing a virus. I was building a highly sophisticated zero-day digital honey trap. I embedded the malicious payload directly into the root firmware of the USB drive, completely masking it from any standard antivirus software. I coded the trigger with absolute precision. The moment Marcus plugged this physical drive into any networked computer and entered the password, the trap would spring. It would not display a balance. It would not open a transfer portal. Instead, the script would execute silently in the background. It would instantly package every single piece of evidence I had just downloaded: the forged cartel loan documents, the offshore routing numbers, Bradley's fraudulent ledger, and the emails between Marcus and Chloe planning their escape. But I did not stop there. I added a tracking beacon. The moment the drive was activated, it would lock onto the host computer's IP address, bypassing any VPN protocols, and ping its exact live GPS coordinates. I tied the automated delivery system to a highly secure encrypted email server. The destination address was not mine. It was the direct intake server for the FBI Cybercrimes and Financial Fraud Division. I hit compile and watched the progress bar fill as the deadly payload transferred onto the small piece of black metal. The drive beeped once, indicating the process was complete. I unplugged it, rolling the cold metal around in my palm. Marcus wanted the keys to my kingdom. He wanted to destroy my life and walk away completely untouched. I stood up from my monitors, turning off the lights in my secret room. I walked back down the hall and opened my bedroom wall safe. I placed the loaded honey trap right in the center of the steel shelf, closing the heavy door and engaging the time lock. I smiled into the darkness of my empty bedroom. Tomorrow night, I was going to hand my husband the exact weapon he needed to destroy his own life. I sat back in my living room looking at the 3 frozen faces staring at me. Let me tell you exactly how Saturday night played out. Saturday evening arrived with a suffocating heaviness. I had spent the entire day preparing the stage for my husband's final performance. The honey trap USB drive, cold and heavy with its malicious code, was already sitting perfectly centered on the top steel shelf of my wall safe. I had also taken the liberty of swapping out my prescription sleeping medication with simple, chalky vitamin supplements. I needed a clear head. I needed to be wide awake for what was about to happen. Marcus walked into our master bedroom just past 10 o'clock. The dim ambient lighting from the bedside lamps cast long shadows across the walls. He was wearing his expensive silk pajamas, smelling strongly of his signature sandalwood cologne. It was the same cologne I had smelled on Chloe's cashmere sweater the night before. I was sitting on the edge of the bed wearing a silk robe, holding a glass of water, and staring blankly at the wall, playing the part of a woman completely broken by the stress of a federal financial audit. He sat down next to me, and the mattress dipped under his weight. He reached out and wrapped his arm around my shoulders, pulling me into his chest. My skin crawled at his touch, but I forced my muscles to relax. I let my head rest against him, listening to the steady, deceitful rhythm of his heartbeat. "You look exhausted, Maya," Marcus murmured, pressing a soft, sickeningly fake kiss to the top of my head. "You have been carrying too much weight. You have been working yourself into the ground for years, and this audit is just the final straw. I hate seeing you this stressed out." I nodded slowly, keeping my eyes downcast. I told him I just wanted it all to be over. I told him I wanted the money transferred so Bradley could leave us alone and we could finally go back to our normal lives. "That is exactly what we are going to do," Marcus said, his voice thick with manufactured empathy. He gently tilted my chin up, forcing me to look into his eyes. He had perfected the look of the devoted, supportive husband. "I am going to take care of everything. But I need you to trust me, Maya. I need you to let me carry this burden for you. This $15 million is going to change our lives. We are going to build a legacy. But the digital banking system is too volatile right now. You saw what happened at dinner. We cannot risk another automated freeze." He paused, letting the silence stretch, carefully orchestrating his next move. "I need the passcode to the wall safe, Maya," he said, his tone dropping into a soft, reassuring whisper. "Give me the combination. Let me take the cold wallet tomorrow morning and execute the transfer to Bradley in person. I will go directly to the secure terminal at my firm. No automated banking algorithms, no federal red flags, just a clean, direct hardware transfer. Then you can finally rest." I let a few seconds of silence pass. I made him wait for it. I needed him to believe that I was genuinely conflicted, that I was surrendering my ultimate control out of pure desperation and trust in him. I let out a shaky breath and whispered the 6-digit sequence. Marcus's eyes flashed with a brief, uncontrollable spark of triumph. It was so fast someone else might have missed it. But I saw the raw, unadulterated greed bleed through his supportive husband facade. He kissed my forehead again, thanking me, and promising that tomorrow everything would be perfectly resolved. I reached for the small amber pill bottle on my nightstand. I shook out 2 of the chalky white vitamins I had placed inside earlier that day. I swallowed them with a sip of water, making sure he watched me take my supposed heavy sedatives. I told him my head was pounding and I just needed to sleep through the night. He tucked the duvet around my shoulders, playing the role of the caretaker to the very bitter end. He turned off the bedside lamp, plunging the room into darkness. He lay down beside me, staring at the ceiling. I closed my eyes and began the most difficult acting job of my entire life. I had to control my breathing, slowing it down to the deep, rhythmic cadence of a heavily sedated sleep. I relaxed every muscle in my face, keeping my jaw slack and my hands completely limp. I lay there in the pitch-black room, acutely aware of every single sound. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The silence in the house was absolute. Then I felt the mattress shift. Marcus moved with agonizing slowness. He slipped out from under the covers, pausing after every inch to make sure my breathing did not change. He stood by the side of the bed for a full 60 seconds, just watching me in the dark. I kept my eyes loosely shut, my chest rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm. Satisfied that the pills had dragged me into an unbreakable chemical sleep, he turned away. I opened my eyes just a fraction of an inch, letting my eyelashes blur the darkness. The moonlight filtering through the plantation shutters provided just enough illumination to see his silhouette moving across the room. He did not turn on a flashlight. He did not want to risk the sudden glare waking me up. He walked directly to the utility closet in the hallway and slid the door open. I watched him kneel down by the baseboard. I heard the faint electronic beep of the keypad as his fingers rapidly punched in the 6-digit code I had just given him. The heavy steel door of the safe clicked open with a soft mechanical thud. Marcus reached inside. He pulled out the black metal USB drive. The honey trap. He held it up in the moonlight, examining it for a brief second. Then he reached into his pajama pocket and pulled out an identical black metal drive. It was a blank decoy. He placed the decoy back onto the steel shelf, exactly where the original had been, and pushed the safe door shut. He stood up, holding his prize tightly in his fist. He walked over to his leather travel bag resting on the velvet bench at the foot of our bed. The soft metallic zip of the bag opening sounded exceptionally loud in the quiet room. He tucked the loaded USB drive into the interior pocket exactly where the 2 first-class boarding passes to Geneva were hidden. He zipped the bag closed and slung the strap over his shoulder. But he did not leave right away. He walked over to my vanity desk near the window. I watched through my narrowed eyelids as he clicked a gold pen. He pulled a piece of heavy stationery from the drawer and began to write. The scratching of the pen against the paper was fast and deliberate. He folded the note and walked back to my side of the bed. He placed the crisp white envelope directly onto my nightstand right next to the empty water glass. He did not look at me again. He did not hesitate. He picked up his leather bag, turned on his heel, and walked out of the master bedroom, pulling the door quietly shut behind him. I did not move a single muscle until I heard the distant, muffled sound of the front door closing. A few seconds later, the faint hum of his luxury sports car engine echoed from the driveway. I listened as the tires crunched over the gravel, accelerating quickly as he pulled out onto the main road. The sound of the engine faded into the cold night air until there was nothing left but total, absolute silence. I opened my eyes fully. I sat up in the bed, throwing the heavy duvet off my legs. I reached over and slammed my hand against the bedside lamp button, flooding the room with brilliant, blinding white light. I did not feel heartbroken. I did not feel betrayed. The cold, detached calculus of survival had completely overwritten any lingering trace of marital grief. I stood up and walked over to the mahogany bar cart nestled in the corner of the room. I picked up a heavy crystal decanter and poured myself a generous measure of 20-year-old bourbon. The amber liquid burned beautifully down my throat, warming my chest. I walked back over to my nightstand, holding my glass in one hand. I picked up the folded white envelope Marcus had left behind. My name was written across the front in his sharp, aggressive handwriting. I slid my fingernail under the flap and pulled out the note. It was short. It was brutal. It was exactly what I expected. Maya, I am sorry it had to end this way, but you leave me no choice. Your absolute refusal to support my vision and your constant paranoid need for control have suffocated me for the last 5 years. I cannot live in this restrictive environment anymore. I am taking the capital to build a future where my brilliance is actually appreciated and respected. Do not try to look for me. Do not try to contact the authorities, or I will make sure Bradley's creditors know exactly who holds the family purse strings. Consider the house your severance package. Marcus. I read the words again, taking another slow sip of my bourbon. He really thought he had orchestrated the perfect crime. He thought he was leaving me trapped in a web of debt and cartel violence while he jetted off to a Swiss paradise with my sister and my fortune. He believed he was the architect of my total destruction. I looked at the empty space at the foot of the bed where his leather bag had been. I thought about the black metal USB drive currently sitting in his pocket. A drive loaded with enough federal evidence to bury him, Bradley, and his entire money laundering operation under a federal prison for the rest of their natural lives. I smiled, letting out a soft, genuine laugh that echoed off the high ceilings of my empty bedroom. I tossed his pathetic little note into the small stone fireplace across the room. The real show officially begins. The memory of that cold metal drive resting in my safe evaporated instantly as a guttural primal scream dragged me back to the present reality of my living room. The room felt like it was tilting at a sickening angle, capturing the absolute chaos unfolding around my Persian rug. On the massive 85-inch screen behind me, the live feed still showed Marcus and Chloe blissfully waiting for their luxury boarding call, completely unaware of the digital bomb about to detonate in their hands. But right here in the center of my home, the fallout had already begun. Bradley was no longer the arrogant tech bro demanding I sell my house. He was a trapped, terrified animal. The realization that his entire operation was destroyed and the Miami money laundering cartel was coming for him had completely broken his mind. His face was slick with cold sweat, and his pastel suit jacket tore at the shoulder seam as he thrashed wildly against the grip of my private security guards. The guards finally released their downward pressure, but kept him pinned by his arms, forcing him to stand and face me. He screamed that I was holding out on him. He demanded that I liquidate my own personal assets immediately. He shrieked that I had $15 million from the sale of my tech firm and I had to wire $5 million to his offshore accounts right this second. He yelled that the cartel would kill him if the money was not replaced by Monday morning, and he commanded me to open my brokerage accounts to save his life. He begged and threatened in the same breath, spitting desperate promises that he would pay me back with interest once he rebuilt his fund. My mother, Patricia, completely abandoned her dignified society matron persona. She threw herself onto my velvet sofa, sobbing hysterically and clutching her pearl necklace as if it could somehow protect her from the nightmare unfolding. She looked at me with mascara running down her cheeks and begged me to listen to him. She wailed about family honor and the devastating public scandal this would cause if Bradley was arrested or worse. She actually had the unmitigated audacity to say that since Marcus was my husband, his debts were my responsibility, and I needed to sacrifice my hard-earned wealth to protect the family name. She cried that Chloe would be absolutely devastated if anything happened to Bradley completely and willfully ignoring the fact that her golden child was currently fleeing the country with my husband. She demanded I stop being selfish and do what was right for the family, insisting that money meant nothing compared to keeping our reputation intact. My father, Harold, could not stand losing control of the room. The sight of his perfect family dynamic shattering made his face turn a dangerous shade of crimson. He marched toward me, his chest puffed out, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate me, just as he had done my entire life. He ordered me to stop playing these vindictive games. He told me that I was going to log into my banking portals and fix this mess immediately, or he would personally see to it that I was disowned. He raised his hand, reaching out to grab my shoulder to force me into submission. He threatened to cut me out of the family trust, to strip me of the Wilson name, and to make sure I never attended another family gathering again. He yelled that I would be dead to him if I let my brother-in-law take the fall for Marcus's crimes, and that my stubbornness was tearing the family apart. The sheer volume of their hypocrisy was intoxicating. I looked at his outstretched hand, reaching to grab the fabric of my dress. I did not step back. I did not cower. I simply raised my arm and swatted his hand away with a sharp, violent slap. The loud crack of my hand against his wrist echoed through the room, slicing through the noise of my mother's crying and Bradley's panicked breathing. My father stumbled back, grasping his wrist in absolute shock. Nobody had ever physically defied him. His eyes went wide as he stared at me, unable to comprehend that his lifelong control over me was completely gone. I walked slowly over to the mahogany side table. I picked up a second manila folder much thicker and heavier than the first one. I turned around and slammed it down onto the glass coffee table right next to the cartel ledger. The sound made my mother jump. I looked my father dead in the eye, my voice dropping to a freezing, lethal whisper that commanded absolute silence in the room. I asked him what moral authority he thought he possessed to disown me. I told him he had no family honor left to protect and no high ground left to stand on. I looked at my mother, who had stopped crying and was staring at the thick folder with growing horror. I explained exactly what I had found while conducting my deep financial forensics into Bradley's fraudulent fund. I told them that when I was 18 years old, struggling to pay for my college tuition, by working 3 exhausting jobs, my loving parents had secretly stolen my identity. They had used my social security number and forged my signature to open an offshore shell company. They used my clean, innocent financial identity to help Bradley funnel his early, untaxed income through a labyrinth of fake corporate entities. They had made me the sole legal owner of a fraudulent corporation actively committing federal tax evasion in my name, so Bradley could buy his first luxury sports car and Chloe could have her extravagant dream wedding. I detailed exactly how the Internal Revenue Service would view this discovery. I recited the specific federal statutes they had violated and the severe mandatory minimum sentences attached to identity theft and tax fraud. I explained that if the authorities had ever audited that shell company, I would have been the one facing 20 years in a federal prison while they sat in their country club sipping mimosas and complaining about how I ruined their reputation. They had literally sold my future and my freedom to fund my sister's lavish lifestyle and protect Bradley's fragile ego. I kept my voice perfectly level as I described the sheer volume of illicit transactions they had routed through my name. I told them I possessed the original incorporation documents, the fake board meeting minutes signed by my father, and the digital transfer logs tracing the illegal funds directly back to Bradley's personal bank accounts. I explained that they had treated my life as entirely disposable, a convenient shield to absorb their own criminal liability. The room went dead silent. The only sound was the heavy breathing of the security guard standing behind Bradley. My father's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. His face drained of all color, leaving him looking old and pathetic. The authoritarian patriarch had been completely unmasked as a common fraud. My mother let out a small, strangled gasp, pressing her hands over her mouth as the reality of her crimes was laid bare on my coffee table. Bradley stared at the folder, his eyes wide with a completely new kind of terror, realizing that I possessed the exact documents that could send them all to federal prison long before the cartel ever reached them. I smiled at the 3 of them, letting the absolute weight of their destruction settle over their shoulders. I told them they were not going to disown me because I was the one holding the keys to their cages. I stepped away from the coffee table, slowly circling the perimeter of the Persian rug. The heavy silence in the room was broken only by the rhythmic click of my heels against the hardwood floor. I moved like a predator, perfectly comfortable in the trap I had built, while they stood frozen in the center. I watched my father's chest heave as he struggled to process the total collapse of his authority. He finally found his voice, but the booming, arrogant tone was completely gone. He stammered, running a trembling hand over his face. He tried to tell me that I did not understand the immense pressure he was under back then. He claimed the family finances were in ruins, and he had to do whatever it took to keep a roof over our heads. He tried to paint himself as a desperate father, making impossible choices. My mother immediately latched onto this pathetic excuse. She sat up on the velvet sofa, wringing her hands and adopting her best martyr expression. She told me I was the eldest daughter. She said it was my duty to sacrifice for the greater good of the family. She actually tried to convince me that committing federal fraud in my name and exposing me to decades in prison was an act of parental love meant to ensure we all survived a difficult period. I stopped pacing and let out a sharp, cold laugh that made my mother flinch. I reminded them that during those exact same years of supposed financial ruin, they had bought Chloe a brand new luxury convertible for her sweet 16. I reminded them of the lavish European vacations they took while I was working double shifts at a diner just to pay for my college textbooks. I told them they did not sacrifice for our family. They sacrificed me to preserve their country club membership and maintain the illusion of their wealth. Bradley, still pinned by my security guards, let out a pathetic whimper. His eyes darted from the thick manila folder to my face. He begged to know how I found the offshore accounts. He said those ledgers were ghosted, heavily encrypted behind layers of corporate firewalls that no civilian could ever access. He insisted that his digital tracks were completely wiped and it was impossible for me to possess those documents. I walked over to the television screen where the live feed of the airport VIP lounge was still playing brightly in the background. I turned back to look at them, my voice dripping with absolute satisfaction. I asked them what they thought my tech company actually did. I reminded them of the years they spent mocking my little computer project, dismissing my career as a cute hobby while Marcus and Bradley played with real money. I watched the blood drain from their faces as I explained the truth. My data analytics firm did not build simple financial software. We built the algorithmic tracking architecture used by the United States Department of Justice. My clients were not local banks or retail investors. My clients were federal cybercrime task forces. I spent the last 5 years designing the exact digital nets used by the FBI and the Treasury Department to hunt down international money laundering cartels. The realization hit them like a physical blow. My mother gasped, covering her mouth. My father stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the dining table as his legs gave out. They had parked a fraudulent shell company and a cartel loan guarantee directly under the nose of a top-tier federal cybersecurity contractor. I told them I did not just stumble upon Bradley's messy amateur ledger. My system flagged his pathetic attempts at money laundering 18 months ago. I had been silently watching them dig their own graves for a year and a half, collecting every single keystroke, tracking every single offshore transfer, and building an airtight federal case against my own family. Bradley sagged against the grip of the guards, his knees buckling as the sheer magnitude of his mistake crushed him. He realized he was not just dealing with an angry sister-in-law. He was dealing with the architect of his total destruction. I turned my attention back to the massive screen mounted on the wall. The high-definition camera feed showed Marcus and Chloe sitting in the exclusive first-class departure lounge. Chloe was scrolling through her phone, a glass of complimentary champagne resting next to her designer handbag. She looked completely bored, blissfully ignorant of the bloodbath happening back home. Marcus was sitting beside her, bouncing his leg with frantic, nervous energy. In the corner of my monitor, the digital flight departure board displayed their private charter to Geneva. The countdown clock showed exactly 10 minutes until takeoff. I pointed at the screen. I told my family to look very closely at the man they thought was a financial genius. I told them Marcus believed he had orchestrated the perfect crime. He thought he had outsmarted a federal contractor and was walking away with $15 million of untraceable cryptocurrency. He was 10 minutes away from boarding a private jet to Switzerland, where he would be permanently beyond the reach of American law enforcement. All he had to do was sit still and get on the plane. But I know exactly how a greedy man operates. I told my parents to watch the screen closely. There is one fatal flaw in the psychology of an arrogant thief. He simply cannot resist looking at his prize. Marcus needed the validation. He needed to see the digital zeros to confirm his ultimate victory over me before he stepped onto the tarmac. I watched on the live feed as Marcus shifted in his leather chair and reached into his jacket. He pulled out his sleek silver laptop, resting it on his knees. He glanced nervously at Chloe, who was still completely absorbed in typing a text message. Then he reached into his opposite pocket. He pulled out the heavy black metal USB drive, the zero-day honey trap I had built specifically for him. My parents stared at the screen, completely paralyzed by terror. Bradley let out a choked, desperate gasp, realizing exactly what was about to happen to his cartel accounts. I took a slow sip of my bourbon, never taking my eyes off the monitor. I smiled, watching Marcus's fingers grip the metal casing. He just took the cap off. The live security feed from the airport VIP lounge bathed my living room in a crisp, sterile light. Everyone in the room was completely paralyzed, staring up at the massive 85-inch monitor mounted on my wall. I had split the screen into two distinct viewing angles. The left side displayed the high-definition ceiling camera I had hacked into, showing a perfect aerial view of Marcus and Chloe. The right side was a direct real-time mirror of Marcus's laptop screen, broadcasting every single digital move he made directly into my home. I took another slow, deliberate sip of my 20-year-old bourbon. The ice clinked softly against the crystal glass. That tiny sound made my father jump as if a gunshot had gone off. "Look at them," I whispered, my voice carrying effortlessly through the dead silent room. "Just look at the absolute peak of arrogance." On the left screen, Marcus settled deeper into his plush leather armchair. He set his empty champagne flute onto the polished glass table beside him. Chloe shifted closer, sliding her chair right up against his. She was practically vibrating with greed. She reached out and traced her manicured finger along the lapel of his suit jacket, leaning in to whisper something in his ear. Marcus smirked, a smug, victorious smile that I had seen 1,000 times before. He patted his jacket pocket, retrieving the sleek black metal USB drive. He placed the silver laptop on his knees and flipped the screen open. In my living room, Bradley let out a choked, desperate sound. He strained against the security guards, holding his arms, his eyes wide and bloodshot. He knew exactly what was on that laptop. He knew his entire fraudulent financial ledger, the cartel loan guarantees, and my forged signature were sitting in a hidden directory on that exact hard drive. He opened his mouth to beg me to shut it down, to trigger a remote kill switch. But the words died in his throat when I turned my freezing gaze toward him. I did not need to speak. My eyes told him that his fate was already sealed. On the right side of my wall monitor, Marcus's desktop materialized. I watched his cursor move across the screen. He bypassed his basic firewall, the one he always bragged about at dinner parties, as if it were military grade. It was child's play. I had dismantled it months ago without him ever noticing. He held the black hardware wallet up, examining the cold metal casing. He thought he was holding $15 million of untraceable cryptocurrency. He thought he was holding his golden ticket to Geneva. I took a slow step forward, walking around my coffee table like a predator, circling its trapped prey. My parents shrank back into the velvet sofa, completely unable to look away from the screen. They were watching their golden daughter and their brilliant son-in-law execute a felony on live television. "Do you want to know the fatal flaw of a greedy man?" I asked, keeping my eyes fixed on the monitor. "It is the absolute inability to delay gratification. Marcus is 10 minutes away from boarding a private charter to a country with non-extradition laws. If he had just waited until he landed in Switzerland, he might have actually had a fighting chance to scrub his drive before the authorities caught up. But he cannot wait. He needs the dopamine hit. He needs to see the money right now to prove to himself that he finally outsmarted me." On the screen, Marcus inserted the USB drive into the side port of his laptop. The system registered the hardware immediately. A sleek black prompt box popped up in the center of the right screen, requesting the master decryption passcode. Chloe leaned her head against Marcus's shoulder, her eyes fixed on the prompt. She looked like a starving animal staring at raw meat. Marcus cracked his knuckles, stretching his fingers with an air of profound self-importance. He placed his hands on the keyboard. I watched the keystrokes register on my mirrored screen. He typed the exact 6-digit combination I had whispered to him while pretending to suffer a panic attack in our bedroom. He hit the enter key with a sharp, decisive strike. The prompt box vanished. In my living room, the tension became completely suffocating. My mother let out a tiny whimpering sob, burying her face in her hands. My father just stared, his mouth hanging slightly open, his authoritarian bravado entirely broken. On Marcus's screen, a progress bar suddenly materialized. It was a simple minimalist gray bar filling slowly with a dark blue line. There were no flashing lights. There were no dramatic warning sirens. It looked exactly like a standard decryption protocol. 10%. Bradley began to hyperventilate. His chest heaved and sweat dripped from his chin onto his ruined pastel suit. He started to thrash wildly against the guards. He screamed my name, pleading with me to stop the transfer. He yelled that the cartel would skin him alive if those ledgers reached the federal authorities. He promised me everything he owned. He offered to sign over his cars, his property, his entire completely worthless life, if I just pressed a kill switch. I ignored him completely, taking another sip of my bourbon. The smooth burn of the alcohol perfectly matched the cold satisfaction radiating through my veins. 50%. I walked over to the thick manila folder resting on my coffee table. I tapped my manicured fingernail against the cover containing the evidence of my parents' offshore shell company. I looked at my mother and father. I explained that the zero-day malware I had embedded in that drive was not just a virus. It was a highly specialized digital extraction tool. I told them that right at this very second, that little black piece of metal was bypassing every single security protocol on Marcus's computer. It was vacuuming up the cartel loan documents. It was packaging Bradley's fraudulent financial ledgers. It was copying the flight itineraries to Geneva. And most importantly, it was grabbing every single offshore banking record proving my parents had committed federal tax evasion and identity theft in my name. 75%. On the security feed, Marcus frowned slightly. He leaned closer to his screen, tapping his finger impatiently against the side of his laptop. He expected a simple crypto wallet interface to pop up. He expected to see a balance of $15 million. He did not understand why the decryption was taking so long. Chloe shifted uncomfortably, sensing his sudden hesitation. She asked him a question, pointing at the screen. Marcus shook his head, waving her off and staring intently at the progress bar. 90%. I stepped back, letting the sheer magnitude of the moment wash over the room. I had spent years being treated like collateral damage. I had spent my entire adult life being mocked, dismissed, and minimized by the people who were supposed to protect me. They had used my name to commit felonies. They had plotted to steal my wealth and leave me to face a violent money laundering cartel. They had smiled in my face while plotting my absolute destruction. But they had made one massive, fatal miscalculation. They had completely underestimated my intelligence. 99%. Marcus leaned forward, his nose almost touching the screen. His eyes narrowed. His hand hovered over the keyboard as a sudden realization of dread finally began to pierce through his massive ego. He moved his finger toward the escape key, desperately trying to cancel the protocol. It was too late. The progress bar hit 100% and the screen froze for a fraction of a second. Then the digital illusion shattered. The clean minimalist interface vanished entirely. The entire display of Marcus's laptop, and consequently the massive 85-inch television dominating my living room, flashed violently. The screen shifted from a soft gray to a glaring, blinding crimson red. The sudden burst of crimson light bathed my living room in a bloody, toxic glow. In the center of the blazing red screen, a stark, bold white message materialized. It did not show a cryptocurrency balance. It did not show a Swiss bank routing number. The text flashed in a steady, rhythmic pulse. Upload successful. United States Department of Justice. Warning, evidence logged and transmitted. Federal authorities dispatched to your live GPS location. Do not attempt to leave the terminal. The glaring crimson warning reflected directly onto the faces of my family, painting their pale skin with the exact color of their digital execution. On the massive 85-inch monitor, the words "Federal Authorities Dispatched" pulsed like a violent heartbeat. For 3 agonizing seconds, nobody in my living room breathed. The silence was so absolute, I could hear the faint hum of the television screen. On the live feed from the airport VIP lounge. Marcus stopped breathing too. His eyes widened to an impossible size, staring at the Department of Justice seal occupying the center of his laptop screen. The arrogant smirk that had defined his entire existence vanished instantly, replaced by a mask of primal, unadulterated terror. He lunged forward, gripping the black metal USB drive with trembling fingers, and yanked it violently from the port. He actually believed pulling the physical hardware would somehow stop the avalanche he had just triggered. Nothing happened. The screen remained locked in its blinding red state. The warning continued to flash, mocking his desperate attempt at damage control. Marcus slammed his palms against the keyboard, pressing keys in a frantic, chaotic rhythm. He held down the power button, desperately trying to force a hard shutdown. But my payload had already rewritten his core operating system. The machine was a brick. It belonged to the federal government now. He grabbed the edge of the display and tried to snap the laptop shut, but his hands were shaking so severely he knocked his champagne glass over. The expensive crystal shattered against the floor, spilling golden liquid across his polished leather shoes. Chloe finally looked up from her phone. She stared at the red screen and then at Marcus, her perfectly contoured face contorting in confusion. She reached out to touch his arm, asking him what he had done. Marcus slapped her hand away, his chest heaving as he frantically looked around the luxury lounge, searching for an exit. He never even made it out of his chair. Less than 60 seconds had passed since the progress bar hit 100%. The heavy frosted glass doors of the VIP departure lounge did not just open. They exploded inward, shattering into 1,000 glittering pieces as a heavily armed FBI tactical team stormed the room. It was a spectacle of absolute overwhelming force. Men and women in dark olive tactical gear poured through the breached entrance, assault rifles raised, and laser sights sweeping across the plush leather furniture. Their voices barked sharp, lethal commands that echoed even without audio on my security feed. The wealthy patrons in the lounge shrieked and dropped to the floor, covering their heads. Marcus stood up, his hands raised in a pathetic gesture of surrender. Two agents hit him simultaneously. They tackled him with such brutal efficiency that his expensive tailored suit jacket ripped at the shoulder. They slammed him face first into the plush airport carpet, pinning his arms behind his back. The physical impact knocked the wind out of him. I watched as a federal agent drove a knee squarely between Marcus's shoulder blades, snapping heavy steel handcuffs shut around his wrists. The financial genius, the man who thought he could outsmart me and steal my fortune, was reduced to a squirming, helpless captive pinned to the floor. Chloe scrambled backward, kicking her designer heels frantically against the ground. She pressed herself into the corner of the leather booth, holding her designer handbag in front of her face like a shield. She shrieked hysterically, pointing a trembling finger at her husband. Even without the audio feed, I could read her lips perfectly. She was screaming that she had absolutely nothing to do with him. She was crying that she was just his sister-in-law. She was pleading total innocence, throwing the man she had conspired with straight under the bus without a single second of hesitation. She actually had the nerve to demand they release her, acting as if this raid was simply a customer service error at a high-end boutique. A senior FBI agent stepped out from behind the tactical team. He was not wearing a helmet, just a black tactical vest with gold lettering across the chest. He walked slowly toward Chloe, his expression completely devoid of sympathy. He reached into his vest and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He snapped it open and held it right in front of Chloe's tear-streaked face. It was a printed transcript. I knew exactly what that paper said because I had forwarded the intercept directly to the lead investigator. The agent looked down at Chloe and read her own words back to her. He cited the exact text message she had sent from her burner phone at 2 a.m. the day before. The message where she gleefully bragged about draining her stupid sister's money and booking a first-class ticket to a new life. The agent smirked a cold professional smile. He informed her that according to federal statutes, conspiring to launder $15 million and actively participating in the execution of the theft made her a first-degree accomplice. Chloe's mouth dropped open in a silent scream of disbelief. Her carefully constructed reality completely imploded. A female agent stepped forward, grabbing Chloe by the arm and dragging her roughly to her feet. Chloe thrashed wildly, her expensive blowout falling into a messy tangle around her face. She kicked and wailed as the agent forced her hands behind her back and locked a pair of heavy cuffs around her wrists. The golden child, the untouchable favorite daughter who had spent her entire life stealing what belonged to me, was marched out of the VIP lounge alongside her disgraced husband. I turned away from the television and looked at the audience in my living room. The fallout was spectacular. My mother, Patricia, let out a sound that I had never heard a human being make before. It was a guttural, blood-curdling shriek that tore from the very bottom of her lungs. She watched her precious Chloe, her perfect societal trophy, being manhandled by federal agents on a massive screen. Her hands flew to her chest, clawing at her pearl necklace so violently that the string snapped. Dozens of white pearls cascaded onto the hardwood floor, bouncing and rolling in every direction. Her eyes rolled back into her head, and she collapsed sideways onto the velvet sofa, sinking into a dead faint. My father Harold dropped to his knees beside her. He grabbed her shoulders, shaking her gently, but his eyes were completely vacant. His face was the color of ash. The authoritarian patriarch, the man who had controlled every single aspect of my existence through fear and financial manipulation, was utterly broken. He stared at the television screen, watching the ruin of his legacy. His son-in-law was a federally indicted felon. His favorite daughter was an accomplice. His own offshore tax fraud was currently sitting in an FBI database. He had absolutely nothing left. He was a hollow, empty shell of a man kneeling in the ruins of his own arrogance, staring blankly at the pearls scattered across my rug. And then there was Bradley. The realization of the FBI raid hit him like a freight train. If the feds had Marcus, they had the laptop. If they had the laptop, they had the zero-day extraction. If they had the extraction, they possessed the entirety of Bradley's money laundering network. The cartel ledgers, the forged corporate documents, the shell companies. Everything was gone. Bradley's face turned a sickening shade of chalk white. His breathing became shallow and ragged. He looked at my private security guards who were currently distracted by my mother fainting on the sofa. He looked at me standing calmly by the coffee table with my bourbon glass in hand. He thought he saw an opening. He thought he could run. He took a slow, silent step backward, retreating from the center of the room. He inched his way toward the grand entryway, keeping his eyes locked on my face. I did not move. I did not instruct my guards to stop him. I simply watched him take another step backward, and then another, retreating like a cowardly animal trying to escape a trap. He truly believed he could vanish before the consequences caught up to him. He reached the heavy oak front door. He spun around, wrapping his sweaty, trembling hand around the solid brass doorknob. He twisted the handle, throwing his entire body weight against the wood, desperate to pull the door open and sprint into the night. The exact second the door cracked open, a deafening noise shattered the quiet of the neighborhood. The piercing, aggressive wail of multiple police sirens erupted right outside the house. The sound was so loud and immediate that the heavy oak door vibrated under Bradley's hand. Brilliant flashes of red and blue tactical lights sliced through the darkness outside, piercing through the large glass windows of the living room and painting Bradley's terrified face in alternating colors. He stood frozen in the open doorway, staring out into the front yard as the screeching tires of armored vehicles ground to a halt on my driveway. The alternating red and blue tactical lights sliced through the large glass panes of my front door, washing over Bradley like a strobe light in a nightmare. He stood completely paralyzed, his hands still clutching the brass doorknob as the heavy thud of combat boots hit my front porch. The reality of his situation finally overrode his instinct to run. He shoved the heavy oak door shut and backed away, stumbling over his own feet as he retreated into the center of the living room. The pastel fabric of his suit was soaked with a cold, terrified sweat. He looked at me with wild, desperate eyes. He dropped heavily to his knees right on the edge of my Persian rug, folding his hands together in a pathetic gesture of prayer. He begged me to stop them. He practically choked on his own words, crying that I had to make a phone call to my contacts at the Department of Justice. He sobbed that since my company built the tracking architecture, I could easily recall the data or tell the agents it was a system error. He promised to give me every single dime he had hidden in the Cayman Islands. He swore he would divorce Chloe and disappear forever if I just walked out to the porch and told the federal agents it was a false alarm. My father suddenly snapped out of his catatonic shock. The sheer volume of the police sirens wailing outside my house finally broke through his thick skull. He scrambled up from the sofa, leaving my mother groaning and clutching her chest as she slowly regained consciousness. Harold rushed toward me, his face flushed with a terrifying mix of panic and his usual arrogant entitlement. He demanded that I fix this immediately. He ordered me to use my federal clearance to call off the raid, insisting that I could not let an arrest happen inside a Wilson family property. When my cold, silent stare did not waver, his tone rapidly shifted, from a demanding roar to a pathetic, desperate whine. He begged me to think of the family legacy, to think of the newspapers, and to just make the problem go away before the neighbors saw him being associated with a criminal investigation. I stood my ground, pouring the last drop of my 20-year-old bourbon down my throat. I set the crystal glass down on the mahogany side table with a sharp, definitive clink. I looked down at Bradley, who was trembling so violently his teeth were actually chattering. I looked at my father, who was practically vibrating with cowardly panic. I asked Bradley what he actually thought that zero-day payload just delivered to the federal task force. I kept my voice perfectly level and chillingly calm, slicing right through the noise of the sirens outside. I told him the extraction tool did not just send a simple tip to the authorities. It transmitted his entire encrypted hard drive. It sent every single hidden corporate document, every ghosted offshore bank routing number, and the complete unbroken chain of his fraudulent operating ledgers directly to the FBI cybercrime servers. I stepped closer to Bradley, looking down at his weeping, pathetic face. I explained the absolute poetry of his destruction. I told him that the transmission was heavily encrypted, but it carried a very specific digital signature. It carried the unalterable hardware identification code originating directly from Marcus's personal laptop. I watched Bradley's eyes widen as the reality of my words hit his brain. I told him that I did not frame him, I did not hack his accounts, and I did not steal his money. I simply built a digital bridge. Marcus and Chloe were so consumed by their own bottomless greed that they willingly plugged a federal extraction tool into their own computer to steal what they thought was $15 million. Two arrogant, pathetic fraudsters wrapping the federal noose around each other's necks. I smiled, looking down at him. I told him I just provided the free Wi-Fi. Before Bradley could even open his mouth to respond, the front door of my house burst open with a deafening crash. The heavy oak splintered inward as a team of federal agents and local tactical police swarmed into my foyer. The quiet luxury of my living room was instantly obliterated by the aggressive, chaotic presence of law enforcement. Flashlights cut through the dim room and heavy boots trampled over the imported rugs. Voices barked sharp, lethal commands demanding everyone freeze and keep their hands clearly visible. Two heavily armed agents wearing tactical vests stamped with the letters FBI pushed past my father, shoving him roughly out of the way. Harold stumbled backward, falling onto the sofa next to my mother, who let out a terrified shriek as the armed men completely ignored her wealthy society matron status. The agents moved with terrifying practiced efficiency. They descended on Bradley, grabbing him by the shoulders of his ruined pastel suit and hauling him aggressively to his feet. Bradley screamed my name. He shrieked and thrashed, kicking his legs out as the agents slammed him face first against the wall right next to my prized abstract painting. One agent pressed his forearm hard against the back of Bradley's neck, pinning him firmly to the drywall, while the other yanked his arms backward. The harsh metallic click of steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed through the room, sharp and final. The lead agent began reading Bradley his Miranda rights, the federal charges rattling off in a cold, bureaucratic tone that stripped away every last ounce of his dignity. They cited conspiracy to commit wire fraud, international money laundering, and severe violations of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. As they yanked him backward, pulling him away from the wall to march him out to the waiting armored vehicles, Bradley stopped fighting the agents. Instead, he twisted his neck violently, looking over his shoulder. He did not look at me. He looked directly at my parents sitting frozen on the velvet sofa. My mother was weeping hysterically, clutching her pearls and hyperventilating. My father was staring at Bradley with a look of pure, unadulterated horror, realizing that the pristine, untouchable Wilson family name was currently being dragged out of my house in federal chains. Bradley's terrified whimpering suddenly morphed into a vicious, spiteful snarl. His face twisted with absolute venom as he glared at the two people who had enabled him for years. He screamed at the top of his lungs, letting his voice echo through the entire house for the federal agents to hear. He asked Harold and Patricia if they really thought they were walking away from this clean. He laughed a manic, hysterical sound that chilled the air. He reminded them both at the top of his lungs that they had personally signed the corporate guarantees for his offshore shell companies. He screamed that they sat on the fraudulent boards they forged my signature on the tax documents, and they actively funded his initial money laundering operations. The federal agents paused for a fraction of a second, exchanging a very sharp, very interested look as Bradley delivered his final devastating blow. He roared that they were not innocent bystanders. He screamed that he was not going to sit in a federal penitentiary alone while they sipped mimosas at the country club. He promised them with absolute furious certainty that he was going to tell the prosecutors everything. He swore he would hand over every single piece of evidence, tying my parents directly to the cartel money. He laughed one last bitter time as the agents shoved him toward the door, yelling that this entire house was going down with him. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind the federal agents, severing the chaotic noise of the police sirens from the absolute silence of my living room. The flashing red and blue lights slowly faded from the glass windows as the armored vehicles pulled away, leaving my parents sitting in the center of the Persian rug like two discarded mannequins. The sheer scale of my home with its vaulted ceilings and massive open spaces suddenly seemed to press down on them, emphasizing exactly how small and trapped they truly were. Harold pushed himself up from the sofa. His face was a mottled mask of purple rage and stark terror. He pointed a shaking finger at me, his chest heaving as he desperately attempted to summon the patriarchal authority he had weaponized against me my entire life. He roared that I was a monster. He called me a vicious, unfilial devil who had orchestrated the destruction of my own blood out of sheer spite. He yelled that I would burn in hell for tearing my family to pieces. He commanded me to pick up my phone and use my federal connections to call the police off, insisting that I had the power to stop this nightmare before the press got hold of the story and ruined his pristine reputation. Patricia snapped out of her daze. She clutched the torn string of her pearls, her chest heaving as she unleashed a torrent of hysterical venom. She shrieked that I was a jealous, bitter outcast. She cried that I could not stand seeing Chloe happy, so I engineered an elaborate trap to send my own sister to federal prison. She wailed about how I had ruined Chloe's beautiful, perfect life out of petty resentment, and that I would never be half the woman my sister was. She cursed me, sobbing that I had turned her golden child into a common criminal just to satisfy my own vindictive ego. I listened to their desperate, pathetic vitriol for exactly 30 seconds. Then I lifted my heavy crystal bourbon glass and slammed it directly into the polished hardwood floor. The explosive crash of shattering glass echoed like a gunshot through the room. Shards of crystal rained across the floor, bouncing off my father's expensive leather shoes and scattering across the rug. The violent noise severed their hysterical ranting instantly. My parents flinched, freezing in place, and staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. For the first time in 30 years, I did not keep my voice perfectly leveled and detached. I let the raw, unfiltered fury of 3 decades rise in my chest and vibrate through the room. I told them to shut their mouths. I demanded absolute silence. I walked right up to the edge of the shattered glass, standing directly over my father, forcing him to look up at me. I told them I was done listening to their pathetic delusions. I dismantled every single lie they had ever told themselves about this family. I told them they spent 30 years treating me like a disposable asset, a convenient workhorse they could ignore until they needed something fixed. I was the black sheep because I absolutely refused to be a mindless, shiny ornament in their pathetic country club charade. While they were busy buying Chloe designer handbags, paying for her fraudulent college essays, and treating her like royalty, I was building an empire in the shadows, I told them they bled me dry emotionally and tried to bleed me dry financially just to maintain the illusion of their own manufactured grandeur. I looked at my mother, whose mascara was running down her cheeks in thick, dark lines. I explained that Chloe was nothing but a fragile hollow shell that they had pumped full of stolen money and toxic entitlement. They created her. They created Marcus and Bradley by demanding a level of fake wealth and societal status that only criminals could actually sustain. They wanted a picturesque family so badly that they actively encouraged their golden children to marry sociopathic fraudsters. I turned my absolute fury onto my father. I reminded him of every holiday I spent alone working in a sterile office while they took ski trips to Aspen. I reminded him of every academic and professional achievement of mine that he casually dismissed simply because I chose to be brilliant instead of compliant. I told him he never wanted a daughter. He wanted a prop, and when I refused to play the part, he tried to throw me away. But throwing me away was the biggest mistake he ever made, because it taught me exactly how to survive without them. I pointed toward the empty doorway where Bradley had just been dragged out in chains. I told them they were not victims of a vindictive daughter. They were greedy, complicit parasites. They forged my signature. They sold my future to a Miami money laundering cartel to buy a luxury lifestyle they could never actually afford. They happily sat on the board of a fraudulent shell company signing off on illicit transfers so they could brag to their wealthy friends about their brilliant investments. I told them they were the architects of their own absolute destruction, and I was merely the mirror reflecting their ugly reality back at them. I walked over to the sleek console table against the far wall, leaving them trembling in the center of the room. I opened the top drawer and pulled out a thick, heavy red envelope. I turned back around, holding it up under the warm light of the chandelier. I looked my father dead in the eye, my voice dropping back to a lethal, frozen whisper that cut straight to the bone. "You say I destroyed this family. No, you mortgaged it." I tossed the red envelope onto the glass coffee table. It slid across the smooth surface with a sharp scraping sound, stopping precisely at the edge right in front of Harold's trembling hands. His hands hovered over the red envelope like it was a live explosive. For a man who had spent his entire life dictating the terms of reality to everyone around him, Harold was suddenly paralyzed by a simple piece of stationery. His manicured fingers shook violently as he finally pressed his thumb beneath the flap. The sound of the thick paper tearing was impossibly loud in the dead silence of the living room. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents stapled together at the corner. The heavy cream-colored paper bore the unmistakable raised seal of the federal government and the stark, bold letterhead of a major international bank. If there had been a camera in the room, it would have pushed in tight on his face, capturing the exact second his carefully constructed universe collapsed. His eyes darted back and forth across the front page, reading the bold, capitalized print. The color drained from his face completely, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent gray. His jaw went slack. The papers began to tremble so violently in his grasp that they rattled against each other. Notice of default. Asset seizure and forfeiture warrant. Immediate freezing of all associated accounts. He could not form words. His mouth opened and closed, but nothing came out. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and bloodshot, pleading for me to tell him this was some kind of elaborate prank. I just stared back at him, letting the freezing silence stretch out until it became completely suffocating. "Do you want me to read it to you, Harold?" I asked, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. "Because I know exactly what it says." I helped the forensic accountants draft the summary. Patricia scrambled forward on the sofa, her expensive silk dress wrinkling as she leaned over the coffee table to look at the papers in her husband's hands. She saw the seal of their primary bank. She saw the words foreclosure and seizure. Her hands flew to her face, covering her mouth as a low, pathetic whimper escaped her throat. "That envelope contains the exact accounting of your greed," I told them, stepping closer to the glass table. "For the last 5 years, you two could not stand the fact that Marcus and Chloe were outspending you. You could not stand showing up to the country club in last year's Mercedes, while your golden daughter flaunted a new private charter to Monaco every other month. You wanted that kind of wealth. You demanded it. So when Bradley came to you with a highly exclusive offshore investment fund, guaranteeing a 30% annual return, you did not ask a single question. You just saw the dollar signs and blindly handed over the keys to your entire life. Harold swallowed hard, gripping the papers so tightly his knuckles turned white. That was a legitimate fund, he croaked, his voice cracking in the middle of the sentence. Bradley showed us the portfolios. He showed us the quarterly returns. Bradley showed you a spreadsheet he made on a Tuesday afternoon, I replied, my tone completely devoid of pity. There was no fund. There was no portfolio. Bradley was running a textbook Ponzi scheme to front money for a Miami-based money laundering syndicate. And because you two were so desperate to maintain the illusion of generational wealth, you did not just give him your liquid cash. You got greedy. You leveraged everything. I watched the realization hit my mother. She let out a sharp gasp, clutching the armrest of the sofa as if the furniture itself was about to vanish from beneath her. You took out a massive line of credit against the ancestral mansion, I stated, laying out the facts like laying bricks for a tomb. You mortgaged a house that has been in this family for 4 generations to hand cash to a criminal. You put up your entire stock portfolio as collateral. You leveraged the cars, the art collection, and every single one of Patricia's platinum credit cards. You drained the entire estate to feed a ghost account in the Cayman Islands. That money is protected, Harold stammered desperately, trying to cling to a reality that no longer existed. The offshore accounts are shielded from domestic seizure. Our lawyers made sure of it. I let out a slow, humorless laugh. Your lawyers are obsolete, Harold. The Department of Justice does not care about your offshore shields. The second Bradley plugged that corrupted USB drive into Marcus's laptop, the federal task force traced every single dime. They have the routing numbers. They have the wire transfers bearing your digital signatures. The government just flagged your entire estate as collateral in a federal racketeering and money laundering case. Every single asset tied to the Wilson name was officially frozen 10 minutes ago. Patricia began to hyperventilate. Her chest heaved rapidly, and she looked around my luxurious living room as if she was waking up from a coma. My house, she cried, her voice rising into a hysterical shriek. My house, my cars. The bank cannot take my home. We are the Wilsons. We built this town. The bank is not just taking your home, Patricia, I corrected her. The federal government is seizing it. By Monday morning, there will be a heavy steel padlock on the front gates of the mansion. The bank is repossessing your Mercedes. Your credit cards will be declined at the grocery store. Your country club memberships are permanently revoked. You have absolutely nothing left. Not a single cent. You are completely and utterly bankrupt. Harold dropped the papers onto the glass table. His legs finally gave out. The man who had spent 3 decades towering over me, dictating my worth and dismissing my existence, collapsed onto his knees, right on the edge of my Persian rug. He did not even seem to notice the shards of shattered crystal resting inches from his knees. He looked up at me with tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. His authoritarian pride was completely eradicated, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, hollow old man. Maya, please, he begged, his voice breaking into a pathetic sob. You have to stop this. You work with these people. You built the systems. You can tell them it was a mistake. You can pay off the loans. You have the money, Maya. You are a billionaire. You can buy the house back from the bank. You cannot let us die in the streets. Please, you are my daughter. I looked down at him, feeling absolutely nothing. No satisfaction, no pity, just a cold, clinical emptiness. For 30 years he had called me a failure. He had mocked my ambitions. He had actively plotted with Marcus and Chloe to steal my company and ruin my life. And now, kneeling in the ruins of his own greed, he dared to invoke the title of father. Patricia slid off the sofa. She dropped to the floor, her expensive silk dress pooling around her on the rug. She crawled forward on her hands and knees, weeping hysterically. She reached out and grabbed my ankles, wrapping her arms around my legs like a drowning woman clinging to a life raft. Maya, I am so sorry, she wailed, burying her tear-soaked face against my shin. I was wrong. We were wrong about everything. Chloe is a monster. Bradley is a criminal. But we are your parents. We gave you life. You have to save us. You cannot let them take my home. Please, Maya, I am begging you. I will do anything. I will get on my knees and scrub your floors. Just pick up the phone and save us." I did not kick her away. I simply stood there as still as a statue, looking down at the two people who had made my childhood a living hell. They were not apologizing for what they had done to me. They were apologizing because they had finally been caught. They were sorry because the money was gone. "You think no lawyer can save you?" I asked, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "No lawyer will even take your calls, Harold, because any retainer fee you try to pay them would be flagged as dirty money tied to a federal cartel investigation. You are toxic, radioactive waste. Nobody in your pristine little high society circle will ever speak to you again." I reached down and calmly pried Patricia's desperate, clinging hands off my legs. I stepped back, creating a physical distance between myself and their pathetic groveling. I reached into my designer handbag resting on the console table behind me. I opened my wallet and pulled out a single crisp piece of currency. I held the $200 bill between my index and middle finger. I looked at Patricia, who was staring up at me from the floor with ruined makeup and desperate red eyes. "Do you remember my 18th birthday, Patricia?" I asked, my voice echoing with terrifying clarity. "Do you remember the night you and Harold decided I was too rebellious, too stubborn to fit into your perfect family portrait? You packed my clothes in garbage bags and threw them onto the front lawn. I stood in the freezing rain begging you to let me back inside because I had nowhere to go." Patricia whimpered, shaking her head side to side, trying to deny the memory. "You opened the front door." I continued, my tone completely merciless. "You looked at me like I was an infection. You reached into your purse, you threw a crumpled $200 bill onto the wet grass, and you told me to call a cab. You told me I was dead to you." I stepped forward and let the crisp $200 bill slip from my fingers. It fluttered through the air in complete silence, landing gently on the hardwood floor, right in front of Patricia's trembling hands. "Here is your change," I whispered. Outside, the wail of police sirens grew louder as a second wave of patrol cars pulled up to the curb. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the living room once more. "Pick it up," I commanded, my voice cracking like a whip. "Call an Uber, Patricia, because the police out there are not just here for Bradley. They have a federal warrant to impound the Mercedes you parked in my driveway. Get out of my house." I turned my back to them, smoothing the invisible wrinkles from the fabric of my dress. I stood perfectly straight, adjusting my posture as I faced the far wall of my living room. I did not need to issue another verbal command. My private security team immediately stepped forward, moving with swift, uncompromising precision. Two large guards grabbed Harold by the arms, hauling him roughly to his feet. He did not fight them. All the fight had completely drained out of him, leaving nothing but an empty, sagging suit. Two other guards flanked my mother, pulling her up from the Persian rug. She kicked and wailed, her voice hoarse from screaming, but her resistance was entirely useless. They dragged my parents toward the shattered remnants of my front door. I listened to the humiliating sound of their expensive leather shoes scuffing against the hardwood floor. Through the large glass windows, I watched the final act of their social execution play out on my front lawn. The federal agents and local police were waiting for them. As soon as the guards pushed Patricia and Harold out onto the porch, the flashing red and blue lights illuminated their absolute disgrace. A tow truck was already backing up to my driveway, preparing to hook chains to Patricia's pristine silver Mercedes. The police officers did not care about her designer dress or her country club pedigree. They commanded her to step back as they slapped an impound sticker across the windshield. I watched my father try to speak to one of the federal agents, desperately raising his hands in a pleading gesture. The agent simply shook his head, pointing a stern finger down the street and ordering him to leave the property. Neighbors had started to gather on their manicured lawns, wrapping their silk robes tightly around themselves as they watched the spectacle. The wealthy elite of our neighborhood, the exact people my parents had spent their entire lives trying to impress, were now staring at them with undisguised horror and morbid curiosity. Harold and Patricia were forced to walk down my long driveway on foot, humiliated and exposed, carrying absolutely nothing but the clothes on their backs and a crumpled $200 bill. They had lost their freedom, their stolen wealth, and their precious, untouchable reputation, all in a single devastating hour. I watched them disappear into the shadows of the street, and then I turned away. I walked slowly across the expansive living room, leaving the scattered pearls, the shattered crystal, and the ruined paperwork behind me. The chaotic noise of the sirens was already fading into the distance, replaced by the profound, heavy silence of my own house. It was a clean, beautiful quiet. Beautiful. I reached the custom marble minibar built into the far wall of the room. I picked up a heavy crystal decanter and poured myself a fresh measure of bourbon. The amber liquid glowed under the soft, recessed lighting, catching the reflections of the room. As I set the decanter down, my phone vibrated sharply against the cold marble countertop. The screen lit up, cutting through the dim light of the bar. It was an automated notification from my private offshore banking server. I tapped the screen, opening the encrypted message. A single line of stark green text confirmed what I had been waiting for all evening. Merger transaction approved. $15 million successfully routed and secured. I smiled, a genuine, relaxed smile. Marcus truly believed he was brilliant. He thought the decryption protocol he triggered in the airport lounge was draining my accounts and funneling $15 million into his own hidden wallet. In reality, his desperate keystrokes had authorized the final signature on my completely legitimate corporate merger. He had unknowingly acted as the final proxy, approving the transfer of my clean, legally acquired assets into an untouchable, protected trust, while simultaneously feeding his own criminal coordinates to the federal authorities. He had done all the heavy lifting for me, securing my future while absolutely destroying his own. I picked up my glass and walked over to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that spanned the length of my living room. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the bourbon, feeling the familiar smooth burn slide down my throat and settle warmly in my chest. Below me, the sprawling city pulsed with millions of lights, looking like a vast, glittering ocean of electricity and endless possibility. The world outside was moving forward, completely unaware of the absolute destruction that had just occurred within these walls. But I was aware. I felt lighter than I had in 30 years. The invisible chains of obligation, of guilt, of constantly trying to prove my worth to people who were fundamentally incapable of loving me, were permanently broken. I looked at my own reflection in the dark glass. The woman staring back at me was not a victim. She was not a scapegoat. She was the architect of her own survival. People always tell you that family is your ultimate safe haven. I spoke the words softly to the empty room, letting them resonate against the glass. They tell you that blood is thicker than water, and that no matter what happens, no matter how far you fall, family is the one place you can always return to. They drill that toxic loyalty into your head until you believe that enduring their abuse is just the price you have to pay for belonging. I took another sip of my drink, swirling the amber liquid in the glass. But sometimes family is exactly the thing you have to escape just to survive. Sometimes the people who share your blood are the very same people holding the knife to your throat. Marcus thought he was a genius who could effortlessly steal my money. Chloe thought she was a mastermind who could steal my husband and walk away with my entire life. My parents truly believed they could use me as their permanent financial scapegoat, treating me like collateral damage to fund their delusional vanity. They all thought I was the weak link. I stepped closer to the window, resting my free hand against the cool surface of the glass. They were all wrong. I did not destroy them. I did not have to. I just handed them a loaded suitcase and let their own bottomless greed do the rest. I lowered my hand from the window and turned back toward the room. I set the heavy crystal glass down on the marble table. The sharp, dry clink of the glass hitting the surface echoed like a final period at the end of a long, violent sentence. The sound hung in the air for a fraction of a second, marking the absolute end of their reign and the undeniable beginning of mine.